Welcome to Not2 Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. Fundamentals of Political Economy, from the Youth Self-Education Series, Volume 1. Introduction by George C. Wang. Fundamentals of Political Economy is a popular introductory economics text published in the People's Republic of China in 1974 as a part of the Youth Self-Education Series, designed particularly for individual or group study. The primary purpose of this series, according to the preface, is to elevate the cultural level of the youths going down to the countryside, to advance their knowledge of the social and natural sciences, as well as to arouse their class consciousness. This translation makes available a comprehensive and authentic text of the Chinese version of Marxist political economy, a version which differs profoundly from that of the Soviet Union. Fundamentals of Political Economy was originally published in 2 volumes. The first volume, 11 chapters, is a critical review of the historical development of capitalism. The second volume, 12 chapters, deals with Marxist economic principles and the manner in which they are applied in China. Volume 1 is an informative historical account from a Chinese point of view and stands as a valuable primer on Marxist political economy in general. Volume 2 will be of particular interest to students of Marxism as it has been applied to the Chinese economy, because it is the Chinese communists, probably Mao Zedong more than anyone else, who first successfully applied Marxist theory to a semi-colonial and semi-feudal society with a predominantly agricultural economy, other than the Mongolian People's Republic. Today, China's sweeping and thoroughgoing social changes, such as land reform and the socialization of the means of production, appeals to peoples in developing countries who are disappointed with the slow progress of development under capitalism. The principal features, some of which we will discuss in more detail below, of the Chinese model of economic development outlined in Volume 2 may be characterized as follows. 1. The socialization of the means of production, chapters 12 through 15. 2. Economic planning and proportional growth between sectors, chapter 16. 3. Agriculture is the foundation and industry is the leading factor, chapter 17. 4. Practicing economy and capital accumulation, chapter 18. 5. Economic structure by the type of ownership, chapter 19. 6. National income and its distribution, chapters 20 through 21. 7. Foreign trade and foreign aid and the future of socialism, chapters 22 through 23. 1. Socialization of the means of production. In the 1950s, a transitory arrangement known as state-private joint ownership was set up for the purpose of smoothing the transition of large, such as textiles, and middle-sized enterprises, such as hardwares, that had remained in private hands in a way that would make it possible to continue the enterprises while changing the ownership system. There were 2 variants of joint operation, by enterprise and by trade. In the joint enterprise, the state was a partner, participating in investment and management. The private shares were to be paid off by the company out of its net revenue. In manufacturing, those producing the same types of products in the same locality were organized into a special company under the supervision of the Industrial Bureau of the local government. The broadening of state control over consumer goods began in November 1953, as grains and edible oil were put under a scheme known as Planned Purchase and Planned Supply. In September 1954, raw cotton and cotton cloth were brought into it as well. The state set up an annual quota of procurement that had to be fulfilled under fixed procurement prices. The planned supply part of the scheme meant some form of rationing in accordance with availabilities, based partly on consumers' needs and partly on the state's requirements for export and for commodity reserves. The operation of these 2 schemes resulted in the elimination of an open market for controlled goods, although government-controlled grain markets continued to exist. Earlier, mainly between 1950 and 1952, lands confiscated from landlords and rich peasants were redistributed to poor peasants. But land redistribution was only a means to an end, because 1. Private ownership was incompatible with socialism, and 2. The landholding after the redistribution was too small to operate economically. This was especially true with regard to the large-scale capital formation necessary to raise agricultural output substantially. Initially, it was planned to make collectivization a gradual process, but the slow growth of agricultural output and the reappearance of such capitalist phenomena as speculation and increasing polarization of income led to a decision to accelerate the process. So, in 1955, the CCP organized peasants into agricultural producers' cooperatives in which farm tools and draft animals were collectively owned, and land, although still privately owned, was collectively operated. The members were paid according to their workdays and their land contribution. A year later, the land too was collectivized, and the members were paid only according to their labor. On August 29, 1958, the Party Central Committee published a directive demanding proper merger of all producers' cooperatives into communes embracing whole townships, xiang, each comprising about 5,000 peasant households. The institutionalizing of the commune was partly for economic reasons, such as economies of scale, partly for political reasons, such as reducing disparities between urban areas and the countryside, and partly for social reasons, such as shortening the process of transition to communism. It was meant, ultimately, to help smooth the transition from collective ownership to ownership by the people as a whole. Thus, by the end of the 1950s, the economy was virtually socialized. 2. Economic planning. The allocation of scarce resources between alternative and competing ends in China is determined not by the interplay of the forces of supply and demand, but rather by systematic planning. As Mao Zedong pointed out, quote, "A constant process of readjustment through state planning is needed to deal with the contradiction between production and the needs of society. Every year our country draws up an economic plan in order to establish a proper ratio between accumulation and consumption, and to achieve a balance between production and needs." End quote. In China, stress has been placed on the proportional growth between the following sectors. 1. Agriculture and industry. 2. The subsectors within agriculture. 3. The subsectors within industry. 4. Production and transportation. 5. Material production and social welfare. 6. Consumption and accumulation. 7. Population growth and output. And 8. Various regions. 3. Agriculture is the foundation. In 1959, the ideological disputes between the PRC and the USSR reached their peak, and in 1960, the Soviet Union recalled all its technical advisors and canceled hundreds of contracts vital to China's industrialization. Compounded by difficulties that had developed in communes and by 2 consecutive years of floods and drought, and in the wake of the uneven results of the Great Leap Forward, the economy went into a period of consolidation. It was against this backdrop that the CCP reoriented its policy to taking agriculture as the foundation and industry as the leading factor. Mao pointed out, quote, "As China is a large agricultural country with over 80% of her population in the rural areas, industry must develop together with agriculture, for only thus can industry secure raw materials in a market, and only thus is it possible to accumulate fairly large funds for building a powerful heavy industry." End quote. Reflecting the increased emphasis on agriculture, grain output was reported to have risen from a depressed level of 160 million tons in 1960 to 240 million tons in 1970, and to 274.9 million tons in 1974. If we exclude the initial period of experimentation with the new institutional forms which the Great Leap Forward established, then output rose from 180 million tons in 1962 to 274.9 million tons in 1974. In his address to the National People's Congress in 1975, the late Premier Zhou Enlai indicated that between 1964 and 1974, the gross value of agricultural output increased by 51%, while that of industrial output increased by 190%. 4. Practicing economy. One of the principal obstacles to economic development is the vicious cycle of low per capita income and a low rate of savings. As Mao Zedong pointed out, quote, "We want to carry on large-scale construction, but our country is still very poor. One way of resolving it is to make a sustained effort to practice strict economy in every field," end quote. Indeed, the ratio of saving to national income in China has risen since the 1950s. It reached as much as approximately 25% of national income in 1958, and probably has remained well above 20% since then. To practice economy, it is necessary to set up a comprehensive economic accounting system. Economic accounting is defined as the activities of recording, calculating, and analyzing the costs accrued in the process of production or rendering productive services. In his 1942 directive concerning the establishment of the economic accounting system, Mao Zedong called for, quote, "centralization in leadership and decentralization in management," end quote. The former means that the state would set up production targets for each state enterprise regarding quality, quantity, variety, productivity, costs, accumulations, as well as targets for profit taxes. Decentralization in management means that, given these targets or constraints, each state enterprise is responsible for its own profit and loss. As indicated in Chapter 20, profits from state enterprises constitute the main source of capital accumulation in China. Each of the production units under the collective ownership is an independent accounting unit responsible for its own profit and loss. The collectives are constituent parts of the national planning system. They sell and purchase according to the prices set by the state. 5. The economic structure by the types of ownership. In China, there are 3 major types of ownership. 1. Ownership by the people as a whole. 2. Collective ownership. And 3. Private ownership. The characteristics of economic transactions are determined by the types of ownership of the means of production. In the third type of ownership, prices are determined within limits set by the state, by the supply and demand in the market. Goods exchanged according to market conditions include the products of household subsidiary activities and the produce grown in private plots, both of which may be sold at trade fairs. The characteristics of the second type of ownership are that 1. The prices of the products traded are fixed by the state. 2. That the transactions are not for profit. The characteristic of the third type of ownership is that all production is determined by state planning. However, since the products are treated as commodities, they are governed by the law of value in the transactions, and money is used as the medium of exchange. State enterprises are owned by the people as a whole, and there are 3 types of exchanges among them. The first type of transaction is direct supply, that is, raw materials and equipment being delivered directly from the producing unit to the using unit. The second type of transaction consists of raw materials or semi-finished products being shipped to a third state enterprise for further processing or fabrication before being delivered to consumption-oriented enterprises. Another type of transaction includes various assorted small articles such as bolts, nails, and screws, which can be used either in production or in consumption. In 1973, state enterprises accounted for 92.5% of China's retail trade, while collective enterprises accounted for 7.3%. 6. National income and distribution. The concept of national income adopted by China is that of material product, net of depreciation. The product for any one year is composed of net contributions from industry, agriculture, restaurants, freight transportation, and that part of trade and communications which serves the materially productive sectors. Omitted are not only passenger transportation and private use of communications, but also finance and insurance, public administration, army and internal security, education, public health, private housing, and all other professions that render services to the people. In the state sector of the economy, national income by distributive shares, or the primary distribution in Chinese terminology, consists of two components. 1. Wages, and 2. State revenue from profit and taxes. The collective sector is similar, except that a collective enterprise may retain a portion of its profits for accumulation and welfare fund. The non-productive sectors of the economy, including educational, cultural, social welfare, and others, receive their share of the national income from what is called the second-round distribution of national income. In effect, funds are appropriated for these activities through the state budget. To a certain extent, the distribution of national income among various sectors in a socialist economy can be carried out through adjusting the relative prices of products or factors of production. At present, 99% of the state revenue in China is derived from state enterprises in the collectives. Expenditures for economic, social, and cultural construction in the state budget rose from approximately 36% in 1960 to 70% in 1973. From 1949 to 1973, the value of agricultural production increased 1.8-fold. Light industry, 12.8-fold, heavy industry, 59-fold, state revenue, 13-fold, and state expenditures, 11-fold. Estimates by Western scholars. The visit to Beijing of President Nixon ushered in a new epoch in our perceptions of Chinese development. Many American economists have toured the PRC, including Professors Vasily Leontief and John Kenneth Galbraith from Harvard University, James Tobin and Lloyd G. Reynolds from Yale University, and John Gurley from Stanford. According to Tobin's estimate, the 1974 GNP in the Western concept of national accounting was approximately $145 per capita. This is close to Reynolds' estimate, which amounted to $150 per capita. Taken literally, this would imply imminent starvation of the population. Quote, "The error in the calculation," end quote, Reynolds explained, quote, "arises from the fact that Chinese prices for basic consumer goods are much lower than U.S. prices. Thus, the purchasing power of the yuan is much higher than the official exchange rate suggests," end quote. Professor Gurley's 1971 appraisal of the PRC's economic performance is more optimistic. Quote, "The Chinese people, over the past 2 decades, have made very remarkable economic advances, though not steadily, on almost all fronts. The basic, overriding economic fact about China is that for 20 years she has fed, clothed, and housed everyone, and kept them healthy, and has educated most. Millions have not starved, sidewalks and streets have not been covered with multitudes of sleeping, begging, hungry, and illiterate human beings. Millions are not disease-ridden. In this respect, China has outperformed every underdeveloped country in the world. China's gains in the medical and public health fields are perhaps the most impressive of all," end quote. However, some economists are less optimistic. For instance, Professors T.C. Liu and K.C. Ye, in their estimates of China's national income from 1952 to 1959, suggested that during 1952 to 57, the average annual rate of growth of net domestic product was 6% per year in constant 1952 prices. A.G. Ashbrook, a U.S. government expert on China, in his review of the economy, sums up the 1975 outlook as follows. Quote, "The economy of the People's Republic of China has proved an effective mechanism for supplying the minimum needs of the population, modernizing the industrial sector, and supporting a formidable defense establishment. With its floor under construction, its purposeful investment program, its control over migration to urban areas, and its hard-driven leadership, China has easily outdistanced other LCDs," end quote. Finally, Professor Victor D. Lippitt, in assessing China's rapid economic growth, stressed the increase in the share of national income devoted to capital formation, an increase made compatible with rising mass consumption by the redistribution of income. He pointed out, quote, "The experience of China in raising her national savings investment ratio by taking advantage of the situation created when revolution forced the traditional claimants on the nation's economy surplus to relinquish their claims is perhaps the most significant in world history." End quote. Concluding remarks. With these varying and provocative interpretations of the Chinese developmental experience, we now turn to the translation of this key Chinese text on political economy. It is here that we develop a keener sense of how the Chinese perceive, through the Maoist prism, Marxian political economy as applied to their own set of priorities and goals for national development. Priorities and goals that are in some cases unique to China and in some cases shared with other developing countries. At a time when a new, post-Mao Zedong era is developing in China, when judging at least from initial signs there will be renewed emphasis on economic development and modernization of the means of production, we feel the fundamentals of political economy provides a timely and valuable means to understand the critical issues that are alive in China today. Youth Self-Education Series Editor's Note. Chairman Mao teaches us that, quote, "It is necessary for educated youths to go to the countryside to be re-educated by the poor and lower middle peasants." In the past few years, in response to Chairman Mao's great call, thousands upon thousands of educated youths rushed to China's countryside and frontier with revolutionary enthusiasm. They have earnestly studied works by Marx, Lenin, and Chairman Mao, actively participated in criticizing Lin Biao, and rectifying the style of work, energetically fought in the front line of the three great revolutionary movements, resolutely followed the path of allying with the workers and peasants, and made new contributions to the building of a socialist countryside. Their awareness about class struggle and line struggle has been greatly elevated. Countless proletarian heroes have suddenly emerged, and a whole new generation of revolutionary youths is maturing healthily. This is a great victory for Chairman Mao's revolutionary line. Following Chairman Mao's instruction that, quote, "We must concern ourselves with the growth of the younger generation," end quote, and in order to meet the need for self-study of educated youths who go to the countryside and mountainous areas, the Youth Self-Education Series was written and published. This series is guided by Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, and includes fundamentals of philosophy, social sciences, natural sciences, and selections from the works of Lu Xun. We hope its publication will contribute to the self-study of educated youths who go to the countryside and mountainous areas, help them to further elevate their awareness about line struggle, their political consciousness, and their cultural and scientific levels, so that they can advance along the road of being both read and expert and better fulfill the needs of building a socialist new countryside and other enterprises. We are grateful to the support given to the publication of this series by the units concerned and the authors, and we welcome the suggestions and criticisms of readers of this series so that we can make improvements. Shanghai People's Press. 1. Learn some political economy. The object of political economy. The great Chairman Mao teaches us over and over again to learn some political economy. This is not only a requirement for Communist Party members and revolutionary cadres, it is also a requirement for every combatant in the three great revolutionary struggles. To learn some political economy is very important for understanding Marxism, for penetratingly criticizing revisionism, and transforming our world outlook of our own accord, and especially for a deeper appreciation of the party's basic line and policies in the whole socialist historical stage. The youths fighting in the front lines of the countryside and factories are our country's hope and the successors to the proletarian revolutionary enterprise. To better engage in combat, to grow healthily and more quickly, the youths must learn some political economy. The object of political economy is production relations. What kind of science is political economy? we must start from its object of study. The object of study for Marxist political economy is production relations. Engels clearly pointed out that, quote, what economics investigates is not things, but the relations among people and ultimately the relations among classes, end quote. How do production relations among people arise? We must start from man's productive activities. Chairman Mao said, quote, Marxists regard man's production activities as the most basic, practical activities which determine all other activities, end quote. But over 100 years ago, before Marxism was created, people did not have this scientific understanding. Thinkers of the exploiting class all opposed this viewpoint. They either championed the fallacy that human society developed according to God's will, or peddled the heresy of heroes creating history. These so-called thinkers glossed over the simplest fact, namely that people must first be able to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves before they can engage in politics, science, fine arts, and religious activities. If people need food, clothing, and shelter, they must engage in productive activities. Therefore, the direct production of material commodities forms the basis of human societal development. Without the productive activities of the laboring class, people cannot survive, and society cannot develop. It was Marx who discovered this law of development in human history. To produce, people must form certain mutual relationships. Isolated individuals cannot engage in production. Just as Marx pointed out, quote, to engage in production, people form certain associations and relationships. Only within these social associations and relationships can there be a relation between them and nature, and can there be production, end quote. These relations formed by people during the production process are called production relations. In class society, these relations are ultimately reflected in class relationships. Production relations consist of three aspects. 1. The ownership pattern of the means of production. 2. People's roles in production and their mutual relations. 3. The pattern of product distribution. The ownership pattern refers to who owns the means of production, including means of labor such as machines, plants, and land, and objects of labor such as raw materials. In production relations, the most important aspect is the ownership pattern of the means of production. It is the basis of production relations. The ownership pattern of the means of production determines the nature of production relations. Primitive society, slave society, feudal society, capitalist society, and socialist society in human societal development are classified according to the differences in their ownership patterns of the means of production. The ownership pattern determines people's roles in production and their mutual relations, and thus the distribution pattern of products. To produce, it is necessary not only to have relations among the people, but also relations between man and nature. Man must conquer and transform nature. The power which man uses to conquer and transform nature is called productive forces. Productive forces are composed of men and materials, namely means of production. In productive forces, tools of production are the most important. The types of tools used for production reflect the magnitude of man's power to conquer nature. But we cannot regard tools of production as the determining factor in productive forces. Quote, the determining factor is man, not materials, end quote. Quote, of all things in the world, man is the most valuable, end quote. Because tools have to be used by man, created by man, and renovated by man, without man, there would be no tools and no know-how. Without man, the best automatic tools are never really automatic. Production relations and productive forces comprise the two aspects of social production. In overall historical development, productive forces are generally revealed as the major determining factor. Any transformation of production relations is necessarily a result of a certain development in productive forces. Production relations must be compatible with the productive forces. When certain production relations become incompatible with the development of productive forces, These production relations must be replaced by some other new production relations which better match the development in productive forces. This is to say, the form of production relations is not determined by man's subjective will, but by the level of development of productive forces. Production relations must conform to the development of productive forces. This is an objective law which is not subject to change according to people's will. The emergence, development, and extinction of certain production relations unfold with a corresponding evolution of contradictions of certain productive forces. Therefore, in the study of production relations, Marxist political economy also studies productive forces. In the overall development of history, if productive forces are revealed to be the major determining factor, does it mean that production relations are entirely passive compared with productive forces? Definitely not. When production relations are compatible with productive forces, they exert an active impetus to the development of productive forces. When production relations become incompatible with productive forces, they will hinder the development of productive forces. As productive forces cannot be developed without changing production relations, the transformation of production relations plays a major determining role. When old China was under the rule of imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucratic capitalism, the landlord and the comprador represented the most reactionary and backward production relation of China. Productive forces were severely restricted and sabotaged. Before liberation, China did not have any machine-building industry or any automobile or airplane manufacturing. The annual output of steel was only several 100,000 tons outside of northeast China. Even daily necessities were imported. Cloth was called foreign cloth. Umbrellas were called foreign umbrellas. Even a tiny nail was called a foreign nail. Under those circumstances, the overthrow of the rule of imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucratic capitalism, the transformation of comprador-feudal production relations, and the establishment of social production relations played an important role in promoting the development of productive forces. Big development of productive forces often occurs after the transformation of production relations. This is a universal law. Big development of productive forces in capitalist society also occurred after the disintegration of feudal production relations induced by the bourgeois revolution and the rapid development of capitalist production relations. Take England, for example, where big development of productive forces occurred on the basis of the bourgeois revolution in the 17th century and the industrial revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The modern industries of France, Germany, the United States, and Japan rapidly developed only after the old superstructure and production relations had been transformed in various ways. On the issue of production relations and productive forces, one of the principal aspects of the long struggle between the Marxists and the Soviet revisionists has always been whether one should insist on taking the dialectical unity viewpoint or should expound the reactionary productivity first viewpoint. Lin Biao, in league together with Chen Po-da, advocated that the major task after the Ninth Party Congress was to develop production. This is a copy of the revisionist fallacy inserted into the resolution of the Eighth Party Congress by Liu Shaoqi and Chen Po-da, which pointed out, quote, the contradiction between the advanced socialist system and the backward social productive forces, end quote. In China, socialist production relations are basically compatible with the development of the productive forces. This opens up a new horizon for the development of the productive forces, but it also has its imperfect aspects, and these imperfections contradict the development of the productive forces. The experience of socialist revolution teaches us that it is always the superior socialist system which promotes the development of the productive forces. It is always after the transformation of those parts of production relations which are incompatible with the development of the productive forces that the development of the productive forces is promoted. Where is, quote, the contradiction between the advanced socialist system and the backward social productive forces, end quote. The criminal intent of Liu Shaoqi's, Lin Biao's, and other similar swindlers' advocacy of this fallacy was to vainly attempt to use the productivity first viewpoint as a weapon to oppose the continuing revolution under the proletarian dictatorship and the basic party policy laid down by Chairman Mao for the socialist stage. This is their impossible dream. production relations must be compatible with productive forces. The development of productive forces necessitates the destruction of the old production relations which are not compatible with it and their replacement by new production relations which are compatible with its development. But the process of disintegration of old production relations in the appearance of new production relations cannot be a smooth one. The transformation of old production relations and the establishment and perfection of new production relations are often realized only after revolutionary struggles. Therefore, if one wants to understand how old production relations are transformed and new production relations are established and perfected, it is not enough to explain in terms of the contradictions between production relations and productive forces. The relations between the superstructure and the economic substructure must also be investigated. The superstructure refers to the national government, army, law, and other political systems, and their corresponding ideological forms, such as philosophy, literature, and fine arts. The economic substructure is production relations. Quote, "The sum total of these production relations forms the economic substructure of society, the real basis upon which a legal and political superstructure arises, and to which definite social forms of consciousness correspond." End quote. This statement by Marx scientifically explains the relation between the superstructure and the economic substructure. In the contradiction between the superstructure and the economic substructure, the latter, in general, is the determining force. The economic substructure determines the superstructure. With change in the economic substructure, quote, "the whole immense superstructure is slowly or rapidly transformed." End quote. This is to say, the old economic substructure has disintegrated, and the superstructure built upon this foundation must also disintegrate. But the rate of its disintegration varies. When reactionary state machinery has been transformed, the reactionary classes do not willingly bow out of the historical stage with the disappearance of the old economic substructure. They inevitably engage in prolonged and desperate struggle with the advanced classes in the political, ideological, and cultural spheres. In particular, old ideological forms associated with the overthrown classes remain for a long time. The superstructure is determined by the economic substructure. Once it is established, it has an immense negative effect on the economic substructure. Stalin pointed out, quote, "the substructure creates its superstructure to serve its own establishment and consolidation, and to destroy the old substructure and its superstructure." End quote. This explains why the superstructure always serves its economic substructure. The socialist superstructure serves its socialist economic substructure, and the capitalist superstructure serves its capitalist economic substructure. In capitalist society, with the intensification of the contradictions between the socialization of production and the private ownership of means of production, there is an urgent need to replace capitalist private ownership with socialist public ownership. But the bourgeoisie controls the reactionary state machinery and uses it to maintain the capitalist economic substructure. If the proletariat does not first smash the capitalist state machinery, it is impossible to destroy the capitalist economic system. The new and old revisionists claim that, quote, "capitalism can peacefully grow into socialism," end quote, is all a pack of lies. In socialist society, the superstructure and the economic substructure are basically compatible. But due to the existence of the bourgeoisie and its ideological forms, some bureaucratic styles of work in the state organs, and defects in certain parts of the state system, the consolidation, perfection, and development of the socialist economic substructure was hindered or undermined. We must make the socialist superstructure better serve the socialist economic substructure. We must firmly grasp the struggle in the superstructure and carry the socialist revolution in the superstructure to the end. Political economy touches upon the most practical and immediate interests of the various classes and strata. It explains the most acute and intense problems of class struggle. Marxist political economy, like Marxist philosophy, publicly proclaims that it is at the service of proletarian politics. Political economy is a science about class struggle. Political economy is the theoretical basis for the parties defining the basic line. Marxist political economy was born with the appearance of the modern proletariat and the big productive forces, big industries. Marx participated in the class struggles of his time. He used revolutionary materialist dialectics to analyze the capitalist society. He revealed the secrets of how the capitalists exploited the workers and scientifically demonstrated the contradictions between the socialization of production and capitalist ownership. These contradictions were manifested as acute antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. With the daily development of capitalist social contradictions, the proletariat, who acted as the gravediggers of the capitalist system, daily strengthened. Quote, "The knell of capitalist private property will soon be struck. The expropriators will be expropriated." End quote. From this, the revolutionary and scientific conclusion of the inevitable replacement of the capitalist system by the socialist system and the bourgeois dictatorship by the proletarian dictatorship was arrived at. Quote, "This conclusion was arrived at by Marx according to the law of economic motion in modern society." End quote. Thus, Marxist political economy, along with Marxist philosophy and scientific socialism, became the theoretical basis for the proletarian political party to formulate its basic policy. On the theoretical basis of Marxism and under capitalist conditions, the proletarian revolutionary leaders formulated for the proletarian party the basic political line of using revolutionary violence to seize political power. They guided the proletariat to struggle for the complete overthrow of the bourgeoisie and all exploiting classes, the replacement of bourgeois dictatorship by proletarian dictatorship, the triumph of socialism over capitalism, and the realization of communism. In socialist society, Marxist political economy still provides the theoretical basis for the proletarian party's formulation of basic lines. Chairman Mao has penetratingly analyzed the contradictions between socialist production relations and productive forces, and between the superstructure and the economic substructure, and has demonstrated the long duration and complexity of class struggle and line struggle in the socialist period. On this theoretical basis, he further formulated the basic line for our party for the entire socialist age. This basic line tells us, quote, "Socialist society covers a considerably long historical period. Throughout this historical period, there are classes, class contradictions, and class struggle. There's the struggle between the socialist road and the capitalist road, there's the danger of capitalist restoration, and there is the threat of subversion and aggression by imperialism and social imperialism. These contradictions can be resolved only by depending on the theory of continued revolution under the dictatorship of the proletariat and on practice under its guidance." End quote. The party's basic line guides the Chinese people to persist in continuing the revolution under the proletarian dictatorship, to struggle for the consolidation of the proletarian dictatorship, the prevention of capitalist restoration, and the building of socialism, and to struggle for the great ideal of worldwide realization of communism. The basic task of socialist political economy is to study and illustrate the law of transformation from socialist production relations to communist production relations. Some understanding of political economy helps us to understand the objective law of socialist economic motion and the inevitability of the association, distinction, and development of various production relations. This will increase our understanding of the party's basic line and elevate our awareness about implementing it. It is of fundamental importance to insist on the party's basic line. It is simply, quote, "to carry out Marxism, not revisionism," end quote. To carry out Marxism, we must first learn Marxism. To oppose revisionism, we must be able to tell what revisionism is. But Marxism consists of philosophy, political economy, and scientific socialism. If we want to understand Marxism, we must seriously study Marxist philosophy and scientific socialism, but we must also seriously study Marxist political economy. Marxist political economy is in opposition to all bourgeois and revisionist political economy, and it developed from the process of challenging bourgeois and revisionist political economy. Learning Marxist political economy helps to distinguish between Marxism and revisionism, between socialism and capitalism, and between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. It will also correct tendencies towards deviation and elevate our ideological awareness. In summary, we must study some political economy if we want to overcome anti-party, anti-Marxist thinking, better carry through the party's basic line for the socialist stage, more penetratingly unfold the criticism of Lin Biao and the rectification of the style of work, and score new and greater victories in the Great Socialist Revolution and socialist enterprise. Combine theory with practice to learn political economy well. Political economy is a demonstration and application of dialectical materialism and historical materialism. To learn political economy, we must follow the guidance of dialectical materialism and historical materialism. Quote, "The dialectical method attempts to understand every set pattern through its continuous motion and its temporary nature. It does not worship anything, and it is critical and revolutionary in nature." End quote. This proletarian world outlook is in direct opposition to idealism and metaphysics. Only after we fully appreciate dialectical materialism and historical materialism, and use them to observe and analyze the law of motion in capitalist society and economy, can we understand why capitalism is bound to perish and socialism will triumph. And only when we use them to observe and analyze the law of motion in socialist society and economy can we understand the duration and complexity of class struggle and line struggle in socialist society. And only then can we understand the general tendency of development from socialism to communism, and why it cannot be averted by human will. This will strengthen our faith to struggle for the ultimate victory of the communist enterprise with full determination and without fear of sacrifice and difficulties. To study political economy, we must insist on the revolutionary style of learning, which combines theory with practice. Chairman Mao teaches us, quote, "We must thoroughly know Marxist theory and be able to apply it. The purpose of thoroughly knowing it lies in applying it." End quote. To combine theory and practice is a question of revolutionary discipline and a question of the nature of the party. We must combine the study of political economy with the criticism of modern revisionism, with the criticism of the reactionary fallacies peddled by Liu Shaoqi, Lin Biao, and similar swindlers, with the three great revolutionary practices of class struggle, production struggle, and scientific experiment, and with the transformation of the world outlook. Quote, "Marxist philosophy considers that the most important question is not being able to explain the world through an understanding of the laws of the objective world, but being able to use this understanding to transform the world." End quote. Is it difficult to learn Marxist political economy? Yes. In the preface to the first edition of Capital, Marx said, quote, "Everything starts out difficult. Every science is this way." End quote. In the concrete analysis of objective phenomena, Marxist political economy penetrates the surface, grasps the essence, and undertakes scientific abstraction. Thus, when we start, we often come across some terms and concepts which are difficult to understand. But Marxist political economy was written for the proletariat and talked about proletarian revolution. If only we seriously study it, we can understand it gradually. Quote, "There are no difficult things, only people without sufficient resolve. If it is not difficult to start, it is also feasible to do advanced study. All that is needed is the determination and the ability to learn." End quote. Marx once pointed out, quote, "There is no smooth path in science. Only those who are not afraid of climbing the steep mountain paths can expect to reach the summit of brilliance." End quote. Proletarian revolutionary leaders spent their whole lives establishing and developing Marxist theory. Following their shining examples and diligently reading works by Marx, Lenin, and Chairman Mao, we should struggle to study for the mastery of this Marxist theoretical weapon, for the socialist revolution and the socialist construction enterprise, and for the worldwide realization of communism.